It's alive. It's alive! Let's see how to add custom entities to Minecraft. Alright, we found ourselves back in IntelliJ once more, and in this hotly awaited tutorial, we're finally going to add custom entities to the game. I think no topic has been rivaled with having been suggested so many times. How do you add custom mobs? And we're finally here. We're going to go through all of it. How to make the custom mob, how to spawn it in the world, how to add custom spawn egg items as well. All of that right here. The one limitation we're going to have though is I'm not going to show how to make the actual model inside of Blockbench. The models I'm using here actually have been provided by me by Pharaoh. Thank you very much for providing those to me. A link to his Twitch channel is in the description below. Leave him some love. That would be great. Right, so let's start with the first thing, and that would be a new package in our tutorial mod package, and we're going to call that the entity package right here. And inside of that, we're also going to make a new package called custom. So we're going to stick to the way that we've done basically the item package and the block package as well. And inside of the entity package, then a new class called mod entity types. And this class is going to look very similar to a lot of other classes we've been using before, which is going to have a public static deferred register right here, this guy. And this is of type entity type and then of type question mark. This is the entity underscore types, which is equal to a deferred register that create or registries dot entities tutorial mod.mod id. And how often have you heard it now? Where there is a deferred register, there is a public static void register method with an iEvent bus called event bus, which then of course calls entity types dot register with the event bus. And let's not forget to immediately add this to the tutorial mod constructor here. So this is going to be the mod entity types dot register with the event bus. There you go. I think the smartest thing is to register the two entities that we're going to make and then basically build all of the classes and all of the files up one by one. This is going to be a public static final registry object of type entity type and then of type buff zombie entity. This is the first entity we're going to create, which is going to be called buff zombie. And this is equal to the entity types dot register called buff underscore zombie. And then a supplier of entity type dot builder dot create. And then we put in the buff zombie entity colon new. All of these arrows are of course completely normal here because we've not yet created those classes. This in this case would get an entity classification of monster down here, this guy, because of course the zombie would be a monster. And then after the closing parentheses here, we're going to put in dot size. Now this controls the size of the actual bounding box, so basically the hitbox of this particular entity, and this is going to be 1F and 3F for the buff zombie. Let's make this a little bit nicer to read. And then after that closing parentheses, we're going to put in build, and here we need a new resource location, which we're going to take in tutorial mod.mod id, and then the buff underscore zombie, and then we're going to say toString, and I'm going to format this a little bit nicer in just a moment, something like this. There you go. And then we also need a last closing parentheses right here. So this is the general gist here. We have a registry object of entity type and then of our entity that we're going to create. This is the entity class of our custom entity, and that is once in here and then once in here, and the rest is basically sort of boilerplate. The entity classification of course changes depending on what type of entity you want to create, and then the size of course also changes depending on how big your actual entity is. We're simply going to copy over the registry object that we've made, and then we're going to say this is the pigeon entity, because that's the second entity we're going to create, and this is the pigeon. And then here of course also pigeon entity, we can simply copy this over, and then we will call this one here pigeon as well. And then last but not least pigeon here as well, and then also make it a little bit smaller. So the classification here for the pigeon of course is in this, well, some people would say that it's still monster, but let's not go that far. This is a creature in this case. And then the size here is going to be 0.4, so 0.4, and then the height is 0.3. Right, so with that, the mod entity types class is actually done, and now we can actually move on to making the entity classes here so we don't get any more errors in there. So in the custom package, in the entity package, right click Java class, and this is going to be the buff zombie entity. This is going to extend the zombie entity right here. So we can simply hover over here, create constructor matching super. Very easy. And then of course we're going to get a few errors, no issue there whatsoever. We'll deal with those in just a moment. Now I'm going to copy over some of the stuff. This is of course all available in the description below, either in the GitHub repository or in individual gists. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy over basically the contents of the entire class, and then we're going to go through from the top to the bottom. So the first thing that you're going to see is you're going to have this set custom attributes. Entities basically have different attributes. As you can see, of course, max health, we have movement speed, attack damage, a follow range, and this in the zombie entity, which is very important, is the zombie spawn reinforcements. This is actually critical that you add this. If you extend the zombie entity, you have to add this attribute. If you don't add that attribute, then it's not going to work. So this is very important. Wanted to mention that, so that's important. Here you basically set certain attributes for this particular entity, and of course there's quite a few. So if I middle mouse button click on the attributes, you can see those are basically all of the attributes that you can use. You could in theory also register your own. However, that is something that we're definitely not going to get into at the moment because that's very much more complicated. Then we have the register goals method, which is super important. This basically registers the goals. So this is sort of the brain of the actual entity. What does it do? And there are a bunch of goals right here. For example, we have nearest attackable target goal, which simply says, hey, if there's a player, you know, we're going to attack that one with priority 1. And then if there's a villager, then we're going to attack that one, and so on and so forth. So there's different priorities for different goals. And this is a rabbit hole that you can go down, and basically after a month of digging through this, you're still probably not going to be done. Let's just go into the nearest attackable target goal, which you're going to see this is a target goal, and I can middle mouse button click on that one. And that finally is the goal. And if I click on this and then press Control H, you're going to see all goals that are actually defined in vanilla, and we can click this button to expand all. So then we're also going to see all of the subclasses. And if I just scroll down a little bit, you can see that there are an insane amount of goals, as you can clearly tell. Like I said, to go through all of those is pretty insane, but usually they are either inside of the actual entity that uses them. So that can be really useful. You can find a lot of other stuff as well. So if you want to make your own, custom goals in there, you have to go through this. There's genuinely so much in here that, I mean, it's almost endless. And then you could, in theory, also make your own goals as well, simply by extending the goal class. Yeah. So for the goals, I would definitely recommend, first of all, sticking with the vanilla goals that are already in there and trying to, use a few of those instead of making your own immediately. But that's just a suggestion. Right, next we have the get experience points method. Should be fairly self-explanatory. It simply gets the amount of experience that is dropped when this enemy or this entity actually dies. Ambient sound simply is the sound that is played, sort of around the mob. And then we have a death sound as well as a hurt sound. In this case, Pharaoh has picked the Hoglin Ambient and the Hoglin Death, and the hurt sound is actually the Iron Golem hurt sound, and then there's also a step sound, so those are sort of the things that you can expect here. And last but not least, there's an attack entity as mob method, which is basically called every time this entity attacks. As you can see here, what is basically happening is that this entity is being attacked right now, and if that entity actually is a living entity, then we're just going to add like these 3 potion effects. So when the buff zombie entity hits something, it's going to add the slowness, the weakness, and nausea to that entity. So those guys are actually pretty beefy. Right, so that's the basic idea of the entity class. Those are going to be fairly similar, like for all entities. Basically, some of the main points are going to be there. So the register goal method, of course, is going to be one of the most important ones because those are basically the goals. This is the behavior of the mob. And if we now switch back to the mod entity types class, we can now import this. So simply go on here and then press Alt and Enter and then import this class. And then all of our arrows will go away. And then the next thing that we can actually do is we can get the pigeon entity class. I'm actually going to copy over the entire class here just one time, and we're going to add that, and we will actually get one error up here. This is the pigeon flying movement controller, which is actually also a custom class. We're also going to copy that one over. Like always, everything is available in the description below, GitHub repository, or in individual gists as well. And the pigeon flying controller basically is almost the same as the normal flying controller. There are just a few different changes. I won't go into too much detail here. Usually the normal flying movement controller should be enough. However, if you do want something that is more custom, you can always extend those classes, override the methods, and just change a bunch of stuff. Right, and then as you can see, the error goes away. And here, once again, we have the attributes, normally the goals, and then we have some of the sounds. The last thing that we have is here the get leash start position. That is something that is a little bit different. But apart from that, most of the stuff is pretty much exactly the same as with the buff zombie entity, at least the types of methods that are in there. And if we now go to the mod entity types, we can import the pigeon entity as well, right? And now we can go into the interesting stuff, and that would be the models, right? The models are going to go into a new package in the entity package, and that is going to be called the model package. And then let's immediately also create another package in here called render, because then we have it. So in the model package, we're actually going to create 2 models, but we don't really need to create those. That's where Blockbench comes in. So in theory, when you're in Blockbench, and yes, I know this is a absolute masterwork. If you're in Blockbench, what you can do when you have created your entity, you can go to File, and then you can go to Export and say Export Java Entity. And this is going to actually export a Java class. Now this currently looks like this, for me at least. As you can see, this was exported with MCP mapping, so that's very important. When you're creating your custom entity, you can basically say, hey, is this MCP or is this Mojang mappings, so the official mappings? That's very important that this is of course correct, because if you choose the wrong ones, then that's not going to work. And you can basically take this and copy this over and make a new class out of it. I of course now have the 2 classes, the 2 model classes for both the pigeon and the buff zombie already, so we're going to copy those over. Right, so here we have the buff zombie model. As you can see, a lot of different, well, cubes that were added and a bunch of stuff. Most of this is already generated from Blockbench. The only thing that is not generated from Blockbench, so if you were to actually recreate this model, this is the only thing that is not generated. This would be empty, the setRotationAngles method. And there I can just say that what you have to do there is basically go through the other models and see what you really need. So the head rotation angles, simply make it so that the head can only rotate around for 180 degrees, and the rotation angles for the legs basically just are the swings that happen when you walk. So this is also something that is fairly boilerplate in this case, because all models that are bipedal actually have those same things. This is basically just a bunch of math, right? You might see this and you're going absolutely crazy. No worries there. I can tell you, just go to the entity model and then you can press Control H and you can see all of the different models. So in the ageable models, for example, there's an insane amount of models. Biped model, for example, is the model where you have 2 legs. So this is the biped model. And if I go down here, you can see that the setRotationAngles has a bunch of stuff in there. Down here, basically the rotation for the right and the left leg. This is basically exactly what we have taken as well. So there's pretty much no way around it. Just try out a bunch of stuff. That is pretty much the smartest thing that you can do. And taking a look at the pigeon model, it is fairly similar as well. The only difference here is that we have a right wing and a left wing, which basically rotate around, and those rotate around in a little bit of a different way. So those actually have a little bit more of a swing to them. However, once again, you have to just play around with the numbers a little bit until you find something that you actually like. Once more, just because maybe some people have skipped over it, the rest of this class is generated by the Blockbench export, so only the setRotationAngles really have to be changed. Right, and then last but not least, we also need the 2 renderers, and I'm going to copy those over as well. Once again, everything available, of course, but they are actually fairly straightforward as well. And as you can see, the renderer in itself is actually fairly straightforward. It simply points to the texture of this particular mob and also basically has the shadow size. So this is the round shadow that is below a certain mob. Literally all it does. Same with the pigeon, it pretty much is exactly the same. It simply points, okay, this is 0.2 for the shadow size, and it points to a different texture. So those are basically the 3 classes you need for a particular mob. You're going to need a entity class, you're going to need a model class, and you're going to need a render class. You of course also need the mod entity types class and register your mob, but that is of course fairly straightforward. Another thing which of course is very important for mobs is going to be the SpawnEggs. So that's the thing that we're going to do next. So we need to create a new class. This is going to be in the custom item package, and this is going to be the mod SpawnEgg item class. This is going to extend the SpawnEgg item class right here. I once again will copy everything over, but at this point things have gotten very complicated that, you know, just me typing everything out just doesn't really make sense. A lot of this stuff is actually not too complicated. It's just a lot of typing basically. We're going to copy that over. Everything of course available in the description below. And the 2 things that are interesting is, first of all, we're going to have this entity type supplier, and then we're going to have this field, which is the unadded eggs. This is basically a list of mod SpawnEggs to which we're basically adding our eggs that we are registering every time we register a new egg. And then down here we simply create a dispense item behavior so that the actual item knows, okay, if I'm in a dispenser and the dispenser fires, what is happening? We're simply spawning a new entity here very easy. And up here, we're basically using reflection to get the actual list of eggs. So if I go into the spawn egg item class by middle mouse button clicking, you can see that this is actually the list of all spawn eggs that are in vanilla. And we somehow have to get this. We're going to get this via the obfuscation reflection helper, which simply is going to get this private value for us. This has to be the unmapped name here, by the way, very important. Otherwise, it will not work once you build the actual jar file. And we simply go through, register the actual dispense behavior with this, and then we're going to clear all of them. So the init spawn egg methods is something we're going to call in just a little bit. But first of all, let's create the 2 eggs. So those are simple and normal items, of course. So simply in our items class, let's just take the oil bucket and let's call this the buff underscore zombie underscore spawn underscore egg. And let's not forget to add that here as well. Buff zombie underscore spawn underscore egg. And this, of course, is going to be a mod spawn egg item. Now, this actually takes in a few other parameters. The first parameter is going to be the mod entity types dot buff zombie without a get in this case, because we actually want to pass in the registry object. And then the second thing and the third thing is going to be basically 2 colors. We're going to do 0x464F56, and then the last one is 0x1D6336, comma. There you go. So this is the idea that it takes. So those are colors in hexadecimal, very important. So you simply have to get the RGB values in hexadecimal, and then if you put in a 0x in front of it, then this is being interpreted as hexadecimal, and those are then converted later. And then let's also add the spawn egg for the pigeon. So this is the pigeon spawn egg, and down here also have the pigeon spawn egg, and the colors are different. So this is 0x879995, and this is 0x576 ABC. So those are, of course, customizable. This simply changes the actual color of the spawn egg. You can, of course, play around with those as well, or, you know, just get a RGB picker online, and that is basically all you need. Of course, let's remove the max stack size here. Of course, you can have 64 of those. We don't actually want registry objects of item. We actually want the registry objects to be of type mod spawn egg item. Right, and then let's change this to the pigeon, of course, so that the pigeon spawn egg spawns the pigeon as well. Right, now somehow we actually need to initialize those eggs. How will we be doing that? Well, for that we need a new events class. This is very interesting. So in our events package, right-click new Java class, which is going to be the mod event bus events. So this is something I'm going to explain. So the mod events here has an event bus subscriber, and what we're doing here is basically this defaults to the following. So this is bus equals, and then we can actually say bus dot. As you can see, we have a mod right here, and then we also have the forge bus. So this defaults to the forge bus, but that's not what we want, because the events we're actually going to use in here are actually fired on the mod event bus. If that seems a little weird to you, you can basically you can think about it as the following. Some mods are fired with forge, some mods are fired with mod. That's pretty much all you really need to think about there. And this is why we need a second method, because we need to actually define this. So I'm going to copy over the add event bus here, and then we need 2 methods, which I'm also going to copy over quickly. And those are, of course, once again, everything is available in the description below. I really highly recommend to get this, because most of this stuff does not need to be typed out necessarily. So the first method is the add entity attributes method, which simply uses the entity attribution creation event, and then adds the actual attributes that we have defined in our entity classes, and adds them to the particular entities. So this is very important. This is an important step. If you don't do this, then the actual game will not start. And then we also have this method right here, which is actually the register entity event. So this is fired when the entities are registered, and inside of there we actually initialize the spawn eggs. If we initialize them anywhere else, then the second spawn egg will not have the color. That was an issue I've been dealing with for a long time, and this actually has been solved by Pharaoh as well. So this is the solution. Pharaoh has found that. I don't know how, but I'm just gonna be a happy camper and say that this is basically what we need. Right, we also need item models for the actual eggs. So I'm simply going to copy them over, and I'm going to show you them. They simply point to the item template spawn egg. That's all you really need to put in there. And those, of course, have to have the same name once again as your mod items here. So as this one and this one, that is, of course, fairly straightforward. Right, and while we're down here, we basically have to add the textures as well. So those both go into the entity folder here. This is once again the buff zombie and the pigeon. It kind of looks like this. This is, for example, the pigeon. And then let's also add the translation to the items, right, just like this, so that the SpawnEggs actually have names, right? And then in our tutorial mod class, we want in the doClient stuff, outside of the onQwork runnable, actually, we want to call the following, and that is going to be the render registry, and then register these two, and we simply have to import both of those here, and then that's fine. So this simply puts the renderer to the actual entity. Yeah, that's pretty much it, right? And those are actually all of the things that we need to do to add the mobs and the SpawnEggs. So let's first of all see if it works and see if our mobs are actually in game. Alright, we find ourselves in Minecraft once more, and let's see. So the actual SpawnEggs have been added. Now what's very important is that we're actually on difficulty easy, so that the buff zombies even spawn. So let's set it down, and there it is. It actually works, and of course they're going to burn immediately. Let's try to give them some shade, and there they are. So that's pretty cool, and let's see if the pigeons also work. They also work completely fine, and they're going to be flying around, so they shoot up into the sky really fast. So the actual goals could be maybe changed a little bit. The actual fly controller there, as you can see, they zip around quite crazily, but that is something that can of course always be changed. And then so the mobs are actually in game. So now let's see how we can make them spawn in the world. Right, the actual classes that we need, we actually only need one class in our world gen package, which is of course going to be the mod entity generation. And this will have a public static void on entity spawn with a final biome loading event called event. And in this one, we're basically going to spawn our entities. Now what I will do is I will actually copy over the three methods that are in this class. Once again, everything of course available, and then I'll explain quickly what is happening here. So this is basically a creation of my own. And the idea is that you have either the add entity to all biomes, which, well, simply adds the entity to all biomes. Then we have the add entity to specific biomes, where you can basically put in different registry keys for biomes. You can basically say, okay, the entity should only spawn in those biomes. And then what you can also do is you can say add entity to all biomes except these. So you can actually make it so that the entity spawns in every biome except the ones that are passed in. So this is really a fairly cool thing to do. And the way that we can then use this in the onEntitySpawn method, we say, for example, add entity to all biomes. Then what we want to pass in is the event.getSpawns. Then the second parameter is going to be a mod entity types, for example, the buffZombie.get. And then we have to pass in the weight, the minimum count of entities that are going to spawn in a group, and then the maximum count. So let's say, for example, weight is going to be 40, 2, and 4. So there's minimum going to be 2 zombies and the maximum going to be 4 zombies, and those are actually going to spawn in every biome. So this is going to be to all biomes. And then, for example, we could then say something like add entity to all biomes except these. Right, the first parameter is actually only going to be the event, not the spawns this time. And then we have the mod entity types.pigeon.get, and then we get once again a weight. Let's do 50, and the minimum count is going to be 4, maximum count is going to be 10. If we were to do this, then actually the pigeon would also spawn in every biome, but now we can actually specify some biomes. So let's, for example, say biomes dot, let's say plains, sure, and then let's also say biomes dot beach, and then let's take one more biomes dot, let's just say, for example, something like the birch forest. So now the pigeon will spawn in every biome except for those 3. And the same way the add entities to specific biomes works, where you can basically pass in as many biomes at the end there as you would like, and it is simply going to work. How does that actually do it? Well, I have made a little comment here. So it goes through each entry in the biomes and sees if it matches the current biome we are loading. Because of course the biome loading event is called for each biome that is loaded, and we're simply going to say, okay, we have multiple biomes here that we're going to pass in. We're simply going to make a stream out of it, and then we're going to say, okay, get the location. Get location, basically, if I middle mouse button click on this, gets the location, which is actually the resource location of this. So this is simply going to be the resource location Minecraft : and then whatever the name of the actual biome is. And then we simply going to say, okay, if there is any match with the actual location inside of this event, so this event here, let's just say that we're currently loading the plains event, then event.getNamed to string is going to return Minecraft : plains. And if we have the biomes plains in here, then one of those is going to match. So this is why I took in any match. So if the biome is actually the case, then we're going to say, okay, in the except these, we're not going to spawn it when we actually find it. and down here we are going to spawn it when we find it. That's the general gist. Here, once again, incredibly useful to have some intermediate Java knowledge, so this is definitely some intermediate Java stuff right here. If you don't quite understand it, that's totally fine. That's not the worst thing ever, but once again, this is another appeal to basically learning some Java so that you can completely understand this. And then of course, this has to be called in our mod world events right down here. So we're simply going to call this at the very end. This is going to be the mod entity generation.onEntitySpawn with the event right here. And that is actually all that we're going to need to do. So now let's see if it works. Right, let's not forget to make a new world for this, just in case. Usually the entity spawn should also work, even if you don't have a new world, but that's just gonna make sure that everything works fine. All right, we find ourselves in Minecraft, so let's see, first of all, if we can find some pigeons somewhere around here. So at the moment we're not finding anything, but I'm sure there it is. So there are some pigeons right there in the water. So this would be the taiga biome. And we can, for example, in theory, go to a plains biome just in case. So let's go to a plains biome. And in theory, if we're in the plains biome, we should not find any pigeons in here. However, we could, of course, find them, you know, sort of at the edges. So in river biomes, they would still spawn and stuff like that. In the plains biome itself, they should not spawn. Now, let's also make it night. So time set night. And let's see if some of our buff zombies spawn, making, of course, sure that we're at least on difficulty easy. Otherwise, the actual monsters don't spawn, of course. And there are some of them already there. There you go. So that's actually the mod mob generation also completely done. Right, and now I hear you say, wait, that can't be it. That's all that there is to it. So this is basically it. To summarize one more time, for an entity, you need three things. You need the model, you need the actual entity class, and you need a renderer. Then the mod entity has to be registered in the mod entity types method. You will also need a mod SpawnEgg item class and also a mod event bus events class right here, which adds the entity attribute to the entity attribute creation event, and then also calls the mod SpawnEgg item in the actual registry method right here. For the egg items, you need the item models as well as translation in the en_us JSON file. And then once again, for the entities, you simply need to add the actual textures in here as well. And those are, of course, defined in the renderer, but usually they should always be on the same, under the same location, basically textures, entity, and then the name of the actual mob.png. Apart from that, most of the other stuff is something that you will just need to play around with, basically adding a few different goals, trying to make it so that the actual mob behaves in a way that you want. And once again, thank you very much for Pharaoh. Link of his Twitch is in the description below, so maybe leave a follow there and write some nice words or something like that when he's live next time. Otherwise, that would be it for this tutorial right here. I genuinely hope you found this useful. If there are any questions, don't hesitate to ask in the comments below. The entire code is, of course, once again, also available in the GitHub repository as well as in individual gists as well. I hope you learned something new. If you did, I would, of course, appreciate a like. But then don't forget to subscribe for more tutorials just like this one. So, yeah.